I'm Jennifer Michelle, and I did the Master Naturalist course last fall. And I have been very excited about pollinators and more about bees and wasps for the last several years. And I was very excited when Christy said, yes, I could give this presentation to you. So I hope it helps you understand a little bit more about native bees and what we need to do for saving the bees. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about honeybees and native bees and how they're similar and how they're different, because honeybees are what most of us have been taught are representative of all bees, and we're going to find out that that's not really the case. And then we'll go over a lot of the basic questions people have about bees and pollination, and then talk about what you can really do. And then we'll have time for questions. So we'll get going. So first of all, how are honeybees and native bees similar? And just for the record, I'm talking about native bees native to North America, which is why they're native here, obviously. Other bees are native elsewhere. So one of the most obvious things is both are pollinators. So the thing is, while we think that they're great at pollinating, they're not equally good. So they are not equally good at pollinating all plants. So that is one thing we'll talk about more later. Another is that honeybees and native bees are both at risk from pesticides. So that is a vulnerability that both of them are experiencing. And it's all kinds. It's neonics, it's herbicides, insecticides, it's all different things. And what happens is each of these chemicals is tested in the lab one at a time. But in real life, these bees go out and get exposed to all kinds of them, and they bioaccumulate in their bodies. So that is causing a major amount of stress on them, and is one of the reasons that they are having problems, honeybees and native bees. Another thing to remember is that because they are both closely related, they are at risk from the same pathogens. And because of the quantities of honeybees, and because honeybees are moved around, it's more often that disease spreads from honeybees to native bees. So that's something that they're both at risk from, but maybe the native bees a little more so. Now, this is a great photo. If you were here and you were a bee, you'd be very happy, whether you're a honeybee or a native bee, because they both need lots of flowers in bloom. That is just a given. They love that. So the thing we're going to find, though, is they don't necessarily like the same types of flowers, and that will be one of the differences we'll talk about. So let's get to that. We've got honeybees, we've got our North American native bees, and that's really where I want to start, which is native bees. We mean native to North America, and there are 4,000 bee species in the United States. And honeybees, on the other hand, are just a single species for the most part, and they were native to Europe and were brought here as a livestock animal probably in the 1600s. So when we talk about native bees, there are 4,000 different species that we're talking about. Honeybees are typically one species. So that being said, because native bees are native to North America, they evolved here with native North American plants. So they have life cycles that are in sync with our North American plants in a way that honeybees are not. So that means that, I'm going to actually back up. Sorry, I clicked a little fast there. That means that they need to have certain plants in bloom when they are above ground, because we're going to find out that they're not always above ground. And we're going to learn a little bit about what that means in terms of what they can eat and when they can eat. But getting back to where they live and all that, I want to talk a little bit about their behavior. So we're used to thinking honeybees are, representative of all bees, and they live in a hive, right? But our native North American bees, actually 90% of them do not live in a hive. They are solitary. So that means it is just one single female, and she mates, and then she spends her life creating a nest, and she will go in and dig out a nest in the ground. Sometimes she will nest in a stem, and we'll talk about where they nest a little bit more. And she will leave what we call bee bread, which is a mixture of nectar and a mixture of pollen. And she'll make a big ball of that for her egg, and she will lay one egg. So it's not the thousands of eggs that you think of in a honeybee hive. It is one egg, maybe 15 to 40 in her entire lifetime. And she will lay that one egg on her bee bread and seal it off in a little cell, and then do it again. And that is her entire life. She's always working, but she's always on her own. She doesn't have sisters, doing the little waggle dance to help communicate where more food might be. She doesn't have anyone to share the work. It's all on her. So that's 90% of our bees. Now, as I said, there are no sisters to tell her, but it's also because they're solitary, they're not usually at risk of stinging. In fact, I don't think any of them that are solitary sting. And Now, one thing to always remember is a sting on a bee is actually a modified ovipositor, so the males never sting anyway. But females that are solitary don't really sting either because they don't have the instinct to defend a nest. They're not protecting it. It's not their job to protect it while others gather food. She's the only one there. She has to work about getting more nectar, more pollen, and bringing it back. She's not going to sit around worrying about who's near her nest. So there's not that same response in them. So if we have 90% that are solitary, what are the rest? Well, that leaves 10% and they're social. But it's a little different than honeybees. Now, one of the kinds that are social are bumblebees, and this is an example of a native North American bumblebee. So the thing is that when we think of honeybee hives, we think of these huge hives with thousands and thousands of bees, and they live from year after year, and you help them survive the winter. But that is not at all how our native bees work. Our native bees that are social are annual, which means that one female comes out from where she's overwintered, usually in the ground under some leaf litter, and she will start an entire hive over again. She'll lay one egg and then lay another, and then she'll suddenly have these daughters and they will help her. And it won't be till the end of the season that she has the full size, but it won't be anything like a honeybee. Instead of it being a whole hive that is going to make it through the winter, our native bees are annual, which means that only one survives at the end of the season. So all of them die off except one that's called the gyne, and she mates, so she's inseminated, and she's going to overwinter in the ground. Everyone else dies off, and she starts over again in the spring. The other thing is their hives are much smaller. So with honeybees, it can be thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of bees. But with a native bumblebee, we're talking 50 bees, maybe at max 500 bees. So they're much smaller. And I want to give you this picture. We've got 90% of our native bees that are solitary. So it's just one bee taking care of an entire nest, doing all the provisioning. And then we have 10% where it's smaller groups. It starts with one, but then it's 50 to 500. So it's a much smaller amount than what's going on with honeybees, and they have entirely different behaviors. So again, even our social ones are not lasting from year to year. It's one bee survives till the next year, but all the rest die off. So let's talk about where they nest. So we all know the honeybee thing, right? Honeybees have a big hive, right? We've all seen it. You can be a honey beekeeper and then you create a hive for them. But that's totally different than our native bees. So 70% of our native bees nest in the ground. And that means that they might reuse like an old rodent burrow. They might dig their way in, but it's an entirely different way of living than in a hive of honeybees. What they're really looking for is bare dirt or sand that they can easily maneuver and dig in to create those little cells where they can lay their eggs, one egg at a time. So I want to give you a little picture of that. So here's this lovely ladybee. And I'm trying to see if I can see what kind she is. She's a Coleopsis, some kind of Andreinidae bee. Don't know exactly what kind, but you can see her little face poking out, and she's got a little antenna coming out there, and she's been down there digging away, laying her eggs, provisioning them, and now she's poking her little head out. It's probably gonna, after taking a breather, gonna go off and fly to get more provisions. But you can see all the little sand particles, all the little dirt around her. That's the kind of habitat that our ground nesting bees like. And sometimes they will all kind of make an aggregation where they're all going to nest near each other just because the habitat is right there and is good for all of them. But even then, they're nesting separately in most cases. So if 70% nest in the ground, the 30%, what are they doing? Well, they nest in cavities. And this could be in logs. It could be in in little openings that might be in your home, but a lot of them are in stalks of plants. So what you see here is a little beautiful little bee, and she's chewing her way down this little pithy center on the inside of this plant stalk. And she's going to do exactly what I described that the other bees were doing in the ground, where she is going to go in and she's going to make that bee bread with the nectar, with the pollen, and she's going to make a little ball of it and lay it right there with and leave one egg on it and seal it off. And she's going to go out and do it again. That's what she's going to do. She's going to chew down and make like a little kind of just one after another, like a stack of all these eggs inside that stalk. And that is going to be how she creates her nest. So these can be in logs, it can be in snags or rodent holes or plant stems, but the idea is the same. And I want to give you a picture to show what this looks like, because I think it's actually really fascinating. So if you look here on the left, this is an illustration. The one on the right is an actual photograph, but the one on the left shows how it is in ground nesters, where they literally dig down and make separate little cells. And the little orangey thing, that's the bee bread. And you can see that the larvae are different sizes in the illustration. You've got one pupa. But on the right, you see the same thing. You see these little larvae, and then you've got one, the third in from the left, that big orange blob, that's bee bread. So if that egg hasn't hatched yet or something happened there, and you've got a pupa starting on the right. So it's an entirely different thing. And you can see how the cells here seem to be made of some kind of a pithy material, maybe from the plant stalk. They use different materials based on the species of bee we're talking about. Some will use leaves, some will make a little mud and make a clay, some will use wood, some will use a little resin. They all use different things to line the cells based on their species and their species preferences. So, okay, so we've talked about where they live. We talk about how they lay their eggs. We talk about, do they live alone or socially? But what about their behavior? And one of the main things to talk about, I mean, their personal behavior when they're not just nesting, it's their flight. And native bees just simply don't fly as far as honeybees. Honeybees tend to fly, really, they can even fly a couple of miles, maybe 2 to 3 on average. They could go more than that if they really need to. But native bees, maybe it's 300 feet. So it's a really big difference. And what that means is if the food they need isn't right there, they're not able to go find it. And again, remember, 90% are solitary. They don't have a sister to come and go, oh, go this way, and you'll find a whole patch of flowers. They're not able to talk to each other like that. So they're a little more limited in where they're going to be. They're very much a smaller range animal. So another thing is that when we think of honeybees, we think that they're around all season, right? And then they live through the winter, this whole perennial process, but we think that the bees are mainly flying all summer long. But that's not true for our native bees. Our native bees are often only adults for a very short time, maybe even just a couple of weeks during the growing season. And this becomes important when we talk a little bit later about what they eat, because if the flowers they need, if the pollen they need isn't available at the time that they're above ground as an adult, then there's no food for them. So they're much more sensitive to habitat change than honeybees in that way. Here's another thing. Native bees have different sized tongues. Some are long, short, some in the middle. Honeybees are more longer tongued. And because, again, native bees represent thousands of species in North America, and honeybees are one species, it's there's not going to be any variation in the honeybees. They're one species. But native bees have very different sized tongues, and that will decide what kind of flowers they can eat. The longer tongued bees will choose different flowers than the shorter tongued bees, and that helps make sure that all the different kinds of flowers get pollinated. So here's another thing to think about. 20 to 40% of our native bees require pollen from a specific native plant in order to produce. And what you're looking at here, this is a little geranium specialist bee. And this little female, she's covered with pollen. I want you to look at that. We tend to think of honeybees as keeping their pollen in nice little, what we call pollen baskets on their legs, and they're all neat and they do that. But a lot of our native bees dive right in there and they are covered with hair. You can see she's a hairy little thing, and they get pollen everywhere. And this is part of what makes them very, very good at pollinating, because anything they bump into, they probably have pollen on them. So it makes it much easier for them to pollinate. So if 20 to 40% of them require pollen from a specific native plants, that means a huge percentage of them can't eat just anything. And that's a real big difference, because honeybees are generalists. You can give them almost any flower and they can deal with in fact, I think any flower, they can deal with the pollen, they can deal with the nectar, they're good to go. But that is not true of our native bees. They need a specific family or specific genus in order to provide food for their young. It's very similar to monarch butterflies. So monarch butterflies, as we know, their caterpillars can only eat milkweed. It's their baby food. It's the only baby food they can feed them. Anything else isn't going to work. It's the same thing for so many of our native bees. They have the specific kind of plant that provides the pollen that their babies can eat. It is their baby food and nothing else substitutes. So this is a little geranium mining bee, and it can only feed its young geranium genera. So this is a native geranium, and so it's doing, she's doing really well here. But if that weren't there, she's probably not capable of flying, several miles to find anything else. So that's why the kind of diversity that we want to see in our habitats benefits our native bees. So that's kind of going over the similarities and the differences. And let's kind of dive into some of the questions that people tend to have. So one is, isn't all pollen and nectar the same? And I think you're already seeing that that's not the case, just because I'm talking to you about how honeybees can eat anything, but the babies of our native bees often can't. But there's actually more to it. So here are two flowers that bloom early in the season. One is dandelion, which is not native to North America, and one is pussy willow, which is native right up here in New York State, where I'm located. And even though they're both early season spring food, which is great, they have very different protein counts for their pollen. So the dandelion has 15% protein in its pollen, but the pussy willow has 40%. And if you think about that, if you were having to provision all of your cells and you were only alive for a few weeks, and then you had to leave your babies with everything they needed to get through a whole year before they come out again, wouldn't you prefer the thing that has more protein? So not all flowers are the same. Some are a little more like our junk food, like they might be lovely and tasty and better than nothing, but they're not providing the same nutrition. So that's one thing to think about how plants can differ. But it also goes into shape and other aspects. So one thing that happens is humans make cultivars. Both of the flowers on this screen are a purple coneflower. But the one on the bottom is the straight species. It's the species you'd find in North America as a native plant. And you can see it looks very different from the one on the top. Now, to my human eye, I think the one on the top looks pretty cool. But because it's got this double blossom we've bred into it because we think it looks cool, it's actually not useful to bees at all. They can't access the pollen. They can't access the nectar. And that's a problem with cultivars. We can say that they come from the same species, but different variations can mean all the difference between a plant that's going to still be a useful food or habitat source and one that isn't. Sometimes the wrong color can make them hard for a bee, or for that matter, another pollinator to identify, or might make them unpalatable in some way. And in this case, as we see, just the wrong shape. It makes it too hard for them to be accessed. So that's one of the things to know, is not all plants are the same. And then here's another one I hear a lot is, aren't honeybees the best pollinators? And it's actually a little more complicated than just thinking yes or no to that. So first of all, honeybees are better pollinators of large monocultures, like an almond orchard or a soybean field. And if you think about what we're learning about them, it kind of makes sense. They can fly very far. They can talk to each other about what they need. They have a lot of help and support with the larvae. And on top of it, they will eat anything. And they're hungry. There are thousands and thousands of them. So a huge farm, a huge orchard is fantastic for them. But you can see how something like that might be very difficult for our native bees. So our native bees are better at pollinating our forests and our wetlands and our other wild areas. These are the plants that have evolved naturally in North America, and that these bees have evolved alongside. And here's another example of a little native bee absolutely covered with pollen. So you can see how she's just going to be fantastic at spreading pollen wherever she goes. So it kind of sounds, when I say that, like honeybees are great for agriculture and native bees are great for everything else. But you know what? It's not even that simple. So when we look at it, and I think some of this I learned from you, Christy, in a previous Master Naturalist, about a third of native bee species in Northeast US are associated with forests. And on top of that, multiple studies have shown that if you grow crops near the forest where these native bees live, it increases your yield. And that applies even to plants that are not necessarily relying on insect pollination to begin with. So they have an add-on effect. So native bees are really helping a lot when they are close enough to the agriculture. Because remember, they don't fly as far. But if you put your your field, your farm field, near a forest edge or a place where they have the flowers that they need for habitat, you're going to see the benefit on your crops. There's this other thing also. Now, this is a native bumblebee, and you see all that orange right on right on her little leg? That is her pollen basket. So she's a little like honeybees in the sense that bumblebees tend to be very neat and take their pollen and put it in a little basket on their leg. But bumblebees do this other thing that's really awesome. It's called buzz pollination or buzz sonication. And what they do is she'll like grab onto a flower with her mandibles, and then she will vibrate like crazy with her wings. And she will shake that pollen right out of it, and it pollinates like crazy, and she gets covered with pollen, and pollen goes flying. And some plants require that, and she's the only one who can do it. Our native bumblebees are the only ones who do this. So this helps native peas, so that could be senna or partridge peas examples, also nightshades, which are agricultural crops, tomatoes and eggplant, and heaths like kiwis and blueberries. In fact, the blueberry is pretty fascinating. So one bumblebee can pollinate as many as 6 blueberry flowers in the time it takes a honeybee to do pollination for a single flower. And that's because of that sonication, that buzz pollination that they do. So they have this really awesome ability to just shake the pollen right out. And that's another pretty awesome pollinating skill that our bumblebees have. So here's another thing. This is the question I hear all the time. It's like, but don't I need to save the bees? And people think that has a lot to do with honeybees, because that's really where we start thinking when people mention bees. And so much of the press on needing to save the bees has been about honeybees. But again, it's more complicated than that. So first of all, honeybees are facing hive losses. And you may have heard about colony collapse disorder. So it's a big problem for our honeybees. But honeybees are not at risk of extinction. They might lose some hives, but overall, they're actually either stable or increasing around the world because, again, they're a livestock animal and they are being raised all over the world because, everybody loves honey, people all over the world. So they're still affected by, threats like pesticides, like heat from global warming and things like that, but they're not as at risk of extinction. So that's why I like to qualify this when we talk about saving the bees. Now, if you think about it, who then is probably at risk of extinction? And if you say our native bees, you're right. And for all the reasons we've been talking about, they are frequently specialists for pollen. So their babies can only eat a specific thing. And if we remove that, they're out of options. They don't fly as far. They're not adults for as much time of the year. So they have so many things that could go wrong that they are much more at risk of extinction when you start adding in increasing heat, when you start adding in habitat destruction. And I want to give you an example of that habitat destruction. So on the left here in the little red line, that's actually the city of Minnetonka, Minnesota, where I grew up. So I was actually very excited when I first saw this because I haven't found many maps like this elsewhere. But what you're seeing in all the brown and the yellow and the greens, that is from a public land survey in the late 1800s to early 1900s. And all of those different colors represent different kinds of forest. So I think the brown was like an oak forest, and some of the yellow I think were willow forests, all different kinds. And you can see how much there was in the city way at the end of the 1800s. So now if you look on the right, you can kind of see the outline of that red shape is what we're looking at. But all those little brown dots and squiggles, that is all that remains of that forest. That's it. Everything else has been replaced with asphalt or concrete, or it's been replaced with lawn. So if you look at how far apart those little squiggles are, and you are some tiny little native bee that can only go about 300 yards if she's lucky, you can see how very difficult we've made things for our native bees and why they are at such risk of extinction. So then we have to add in something else. Not only we've been destroying all of this habitat, but we've been bringing in honeybees by the truckload, and we've been now raising them even more as a hobby because we think it's helping save the bees. And here's a little fact that people don't realize. Because of the differences between native bees and honeybees, a single honeybee hive can consume as much pollen as 100,000 of our native bees in a single season. So right there, it helps you see the impact a hive can have on our native bees and how they are also adding to the fight for survival that our native bees are having. Now, that all sounds very doom and gloom, but actually there's a pretty easy way to fix a lot of this. And here's a long quote, and it says, "We know the main reason our native pollinators are in decline is a lack of wildflowers." Well, he's saying wildflowers, but specifically it's native flowers. Native plants are what our native bees need, and honeybees are perfectly happy to use them as well. So it doesn't really do anything negative to honeybees if you plant for native species, just like you would plant native species for bees, just like you would for any pollinator. The difference is that it will be incredibly helpful to our native bee populations to have native plants in large numbers all around them. It increases their habitat incredibly. So that is really what we want to talk about, how to really save the bees. And when we talk about that, what we really mean is create habitat. So here's an example of a field that is full of native plants. To North America. You see a lot of black-eyed Susan in there. You see some poppy. I think that's a blanket flower in the lower left. What you're seeing here is something that would make a native bee very, very happy, but it's also going to make a honeybee very happy. So what you want is to create habitat that is native to your area. So wherever you are, find the plants native to your region and plant them. You can add them to your garden. You can create a separate garden just for them. You can get your town involved, whatever you want to do, but planting more native species is the way to help the bees. You want to have them in bloom from early spring to late fall. The way I do this is I started planting and then I would realize, I don't really have a lot in bloom, maybe in late May or in early July. And then I would find a plant native to my area and I would find out when it bloomed. And if it bloomed that time, I would get it and plant it. So it develops over time. It's not like you have to go and do it all at once, but the more you can create habitat, the more you can help save the bees. Another thing to consider is mowing. Mowing chops off a lot of flowering plants. And since one of the biggest habitat destructors that we have is lawn, what happens is lawn is not the greatest for specialist bees because it doesn't have any of the specialist native plants. But for the maybe 60% of native bees that are still able to eat like a generalist diet, then mowing lops off dandelion and clover. And these are not ideal foods. We saw they don't have as much, at least the dandelion doesn't have as much pollen as other native plants, but it's something. So if you have nothing versus you have something, that's better, right? It's still an improvement. So I would suggest thinking about mowing less and maybe even replacing more of your lawn to make native habitat. So another thing that really helps save the bees, and this very much helps native bees, but it's also going to help your honeybees, it's to reduce or eliminate pesticide use. Pesticides, as we were talking about earlier, they accumulate in their bodies. They're not getting just one dose and that's it. They're getting multiple doses from all different things every single day. So it is making them sicker and they're not able to find food as well. They're not able to navigate as well, and they're not going to survive as well. This includes lawn spraying. It's not just if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to spray, for wasps or I'm going to spray for bees. It's also things like what you spray on your lawn to keep it looking like a carpet. That is a lot of herbicide, but it's a lot of other pesticides, and it's things that they wind up ingesting, and it does cause harm. Another thing that helps save the bees is rethinking garden cleanup. In fact, the whole idea of cleanup is maybe something we don't really want to do. So if you remember, I was saying how our annual bumblebees, the one female that survives at the end of the season goes and nests in the ground under leaf litter. Well, if we've raked up all the leaves in the fall, that's not good for her survival. But if we leave a layer of leaves, that gives her insulation. Another thing we can do is leave some of these wooden logs or fallen snags that are in our forests or in our backyard, leave some because that is habitat for them. And leave little patches of dirt. We can see a little ground nesting bee nest on the far left, and on the far right, those stalks. We don't need to trim everything down to the ground. If you leave like a 12-inch stalk on your perennials that are native in the spring, just cut them down in the spring because at that point, if it's bloomed last year, you don't cut them in the fall. You leave it there for the seed to be food for the birds. Come spring, you cut it down to about 12 inches high, and that plant will grow over it because it's a perennial, and you won't even see it. But next winter, that will be easy access to nesting for native bees. So Again, it's providing bare dirt and sand, stems, leaf litter. One thing I'd also suggest is avoiding plastic landscaping paper because that is hard for them to chew through. They have to dig down into the ground, and if you have landscaping paper there that's plastic, they're not going to be able to do that. I would also suggest reducing mulch in your garden because that is also very hard for these tiny bees to dig through. Now, if you have a little, and if you have space in between that shows some exposed ground, they can get around that. But that thick mulch that people like, that's very hard for them. So what else can you do? Well, invasive plants. Invasive plants are here because they have gotten a foothold. We've removed a lot of the things that would keep our ecosystem in balance, and they have no predators here. So they grow and grow and grow, and they take over the space of native plants. And when they do that, they remove habitat for our native bees, especially the ones that are specialists. Another thing you can do, and I know some of you were talking about these flowers earlier before we started doing this presentation, there are these things called spring ephemerals. And for those of you who are not familiar with them, they are flowers that are native plants, and they come out and bloom right now, early in the season, at least where I am in Northern New York. And they come out early and bloom before the canopy comes in on the deciduous trees. So they get all the sunlight, and then by the time the leaves have filled in, they're done, and they're done blooming for the year. So they come out now and they have this amazing early season food source. And there are a lot of native bees that then emerge at this time and need those flowers because that's what they're relying on. That's what's keeping them going. So one thing to keep in mind is this isn't just about ecologists or naturalists trying to help. Beekeepers are actually, like people who love honeybees and dedicate their lives to honeybees, are actually seeing that this problem is growing and trying to help. And I want to give you some examples of what's happened, because beekeeping becomes kind of a hobby, and there are peaks and valleys in when it suddenly is popular. And about 10 or so years ago in London, urban beekeeping became a trend. And unfortunately, people really weren't thinking about it the way they needed to, because most of us aren't taught how bees really live. And while we would never think that you would get chickens and then not provide food for them, but just expect your neighbors somehow to feed them, you would never get like a cat or a dog and never feed them and just expect your neighbors to do that. People do that with honeybees all the time. They get hives and they just let them go and let them fly around. And they're not getting that they have to find flowers somewhere. And who was eating those flowers before that hive arrived? That 100,000 strong hive that is now descending on maybe patches of native plants that were the only source of nectar and pollen for some of the native bees. So in London, even though honeybees are native to Europe, and I believe are native also to London, though don't quote me on that, they got to a point where they actually had 10 hives per square kilometer in London, which, if you might recall, is an enormous city and is full of brick and stone and concrete and asphalt, and not so much fields of flowers. So they had massive die-off because the honeybees simply couldn't find enough food. So beekeepers are starting to realize that there needs to be more education, because people don't understand that it's not magic. They're eating something and then making honey. It's not just they go out and magically make it. Slovenia had a similar problem. Slovenia is very big on honey and beekeeping. And they found out just a couple years ago, it got so popular there that they were actually making less honey, even though they had more hives. And of course, that makes sense, because what happens is there isn't enough food for everyone. So beekeepers are getting concerned about this. There needs to be enough habitat, not just for native bees, but even for honeybees. So, okay, this is what communities can do. And as master naturalists, this is something we can advocate for or help our communities do. So one thing is to try and advocate for apiaries being separated by at least 4 miles. And the reason you do that is because that's roughly how far bees are typically going to fly. A honeybee is typically going to fly. Now, this means not just 4 miles from each other, but also from any endangered pollinators or preserves or any habitat that has high biodiversity and that needs protecting. For instance, where I live, it's near Wilton Wildlife Park, where there is a Carner butterfly preserve, which is an endangered butterfly in our area. And you really wouldn't want honeybees descending on that there, because it is a preserve, and we want to keep the native bees that are flying around there able to survive, and that keeps that whole ecosystem going. So thinking about spacing out apiaries is really important. Another thing is thinking about how many hives are in an apiary. Now, if somebody is a commercial producer, that is one thing, that's maybe the industry that they're in. But for hobbyists, you really need to start considering, do you need another hive? Is that really the best way to enjoy bees and to support them? And they recommend a max of 20 hives per apiary. So here's another one that always floors honey beekeepers when I talk to them. But the actual recommendation is for every hive, not every apiary, but for every hive, plant 5 acres of native forage. So here's a lot of what looks like Rudbeckia. This looks like a lot of black-eyed Susan, this huge field. And that is more than most people have in their backyard when they think of getting a backyard hive. So I always say to people, it doesn't necessarily have to be on your property. It needs to be nearby. And the best way to do that is to start advocating. Advocate in your community for habitat creation, have pollinator pathways, parks, roadsides. Get them to plant along roadsides or just stop mowing the roadsides so much so that native plants have a chance to flower. You can wind up putting in a ton of acreage of native plants without realizing it, just by expanding your advocacy to your community. Another thing I want you to think about is where in your towns and cities are there places like this? So this is supposed to be a lovely green space, but it's all grass and it's not even used. It doesn't seem to have, a baseball diamond. It doesn't have any picnic tables. It doesn't seem to be used. There's no walking path. It's just lawn that this city is paying to mow. And there's really no habitat there. There might be some dandelions or something here or there. But if this were replaced with a native plant garden, that would provide a huge amount of food for a lot of native bees, as well as honeybees, if they're in the area. So trying to think about where in your community is there lawn that isn't really being used, but is just a huge expansive lawn, and what could you plant there instead? So to really save the bees, I guess my message to you is provide native plants. Give them ample native plant forage and think about native bee life cycles so that you can actually protect the native bees. And there we go. That's the presentation. So if you have questions here, let me stop the share here.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm shocked. 5 acres of forage per hive. That is a lot.
That is a lot, but I actually gave a talk on this about a month ago to Capital Area Beekeepers Association. And it's amazing how some of them say, they have 100 acres and they will start paying attention to what they're planting there. And some said they had tens and tens of acres of forest and they wanted to know what they could plant there. And they were very excited about it. They love bees.
Yeah.
So it is possible. And if you think about roadside, there's a lot of room there. There's a lot of road. And if you think of, whenever I drive down towards Albany, you see all these big professional office buildings and they're just covered with lawn. And all it is mowed and sprayed and mowed and sprayed, which is difficult for bees on many levels. So if we think beyond our yard, though it's always good to plant our yard, it instantly becomes possible. And remember, it can include rooftop gardens, it can include container gardens, it can include vertical gardens. There are a lot of options for adding forage.
Yes. Fantastic. Do you know, I'm from Pennsylvania, and years ago, I worked for a consulting firm, and we did a lot of environmental review for projects that were, roadway projects, and could recommend, that they planted things in the median strips and along the roadsides that would be beneficial. Do you know if there's anything happening in New York State with the Department of Transportation or with any counties, and has there been any success there? Because it seems like, I think you're right. There's a good opportunity there if you could find, something that might be compatible.
I know that that we have a pollinator protection plan in the state. I know the state is very much advocating for more, like I think 30 million trees to be planted in the next few years. And also they're trying to set up a native plant seed bank, because it's very hard to put there's just a lack of native seed around the country. So it's very hard for people who want to do this to have the quantity to get started. Now, that's not a problem for individual homeowners who might have an area they want to plant. You can get that. But when you have fields, that's been difficult, though there are places that can do that. So I think there is a movement towards it, but it needs more education. People simply don't know, and they think they're protecting bees, and they just don't know. They just don't get it. And it's just a very tricky thing because people don't always want to know, and sometimes it alarms them. But mostly I found people, once they hear it, get it. They're like, oh, and then they get excited about it. So I'm pretty hopeful. I'm up where I live, just north of us in Warren County. They do plant a plot for pollinators. And if you commit to keep a certain size area on your land full of native seed or native plants for 5 years minimum, they will give you free seed. So, and there are initiatives like that all across the country.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, there are some questions in the chat box, so I'll read them for you. Thea asks, can you share anything about carpenter bees and their role in the environment?
Carpenter bees are a native bee, and they're as helpful with pollinating as others. I know they get a bad rap because they do like to nest in wood. I don't know much about them specifically. If you, let's see, let me see if I can show you a book here. Probably a great one. You see this? Bees?
Yes.
It's called Bees by Heather Holm. Any of her work is probably the best information you can find on native bees or native wasps in North America. So I can, here, I can type that into the chat. So author Heather Holm. And she would be the best source, I would say.
Okay, Dave Shepard says, really, really good information. Had no idea about the diversity in different bee species. Do you have a bibliography of source material that we could use for further research or backup for advocacy efforts?
Yeah, I can share some resources. Do you want me to copy them into the chat, or should I just give them to you afterwards, Christy, to share with the group? Or
you could do either. I mean, you could send them to me and I could share them.
I'll do that then, because
in one
I don't know that they're
solid
gonna.
email.
I have to go digging for them, but yeah, I'd absolutely be happy to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Suzanne asks, what can be done to save carpenter bees? So many people set traps to kill them at this time of year.
Saving carpenter bees is no different than saving other bees. Give them habitat, keep them away from pesticides, educate your neighbors about them. That's the thing. It's helping them understand how to live with them. If they're destroying their home, that's going to be a problem. Maybe give them other habitat that they might prefer. So again, I'm not a carpenter bee specialist.
Okay. Alan asks, the one bee overwintering must apply to just a limited area? Not quite sure.
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
Alan, do you want to unmute and clarify what you meant there?
Yeah.
Alan? Maybe Alan's gone. Okay.
Well, let me try and just say that that's a bumblebee life cycle. And I don't think that's a limited area. That's how our native bumblebees are. That's to my knowledge.
Okay. Okay. See, there's some comments, and I will share those with you. But lawns are so difficult to change into meadow habitat. Can you recommend best practices for lawn removal?
What I do, here, let me actually see if I can actually show you some of my yard. Let me see if I can change my background.
Yeah, and Chris just put in a link to some photos of his yard that used to be lawn and what it looks like. And I've seen it before, so I know.
Yeah, I don't think I have one here. Oh, here I do. Let's see. So you see that? Let me move out of the way. So that's my front yard from last summer. So it's a lot of native plants with a grass path in the middle. What we have found that works for us, and I've tried a lot of different things. I've tried sod removal, which I thought I was going to be all gung-ho, and I do not recommend. We put down cardboard. So we save from Amazon boxes. Our neighbors bring it to us. We go and raid Pharmacy dumpsters have a lot of cardboard and they don't seem to send it back the way grocery stores do. So we dumpster dive with a
Okay.
lot of
Good
cardboard and we lay it
reuse
on the ground.
there.
I'm sorry, Christy.
That's a good reuse of
Yeah, that's what
material.
we do. So, and then we get mulch. And I know I said not a lot of mulch, but we use it mainly to hold the cardboard in place on the lawn. And what we did last year, it's taken us like 4 years to have this brilliant idea, which is we did it in the fall. So now it's overwintered. So when we go to plant later on this year, it's really easy to cut through. Whereas if you do it right away, which is how we've done all of our other ones, you're like stabbing, with your little implements into the cardboard and trying to rip it. It's a pain. But
Yeah.
if you want to do it all at once, believe me, you can. So you put the cardboard down, spray it with water so it stays in place a little bit and it's easier to work with, and then cut like an X and dig down there into a hole and plant in there. And when you've done making all your X's and planting all your native plants in there, then put some mulch just around them, just enough to hold it in place. And that should be enough to get it going. If you have existing gardens, you can either add native plants to your gardens or remove some of your previous plants and put those in instead. So you might have existing foundation beds or other things.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Um, Mandy asks, what do the male solitary bees do if they're not nest building?
I think they have sex and eat and die.
Okay,
I think it's not a bad life.
very simple life.
I think they're hanging out by the nest when the females emerge and they hope to find a mate. And
Okay.
there you go.
All right. Colette says, what a wonderful presentation. I don't quite understand the aspect of just the one female hibernating and digging herself into sandy soil in the fall. How or why just the one female?
I don't know why. It's how bumblebees are. They just have one that lives at the end of the season and starts the nest next year. That's just what they do. It's like the solitary bees, when they're done laying their eggs, they die off, and the eggs are the ones that over the winter and they all grow up as children underground. And then the next year they come out at different times in spring or summer and they do it all again. And with bumblebees, it's just a little different. It's one female, but she makes a group of her daughters and then they all help, and then she has some sons, and then she mates, or one of the daughters and sons, I mean, they must mate. And sorry, I never said it out loud, but it is, I mean, they're all from the one female, so they're all family. And then everybody dies off. It's just the one female who lives, and she goes and nests over the winter and does it again. It's just their life cycle.
Hmm. Okay. Chris mentions that he's going to be up your way in the second half of August and it would be great to meet up. And he's
Oh,
also wondering,
absolutely.
do
You've
you
got
use
my email.
iNaturalist?
Email
And
me
if
for
so,
sure.
what's your username? I think he'd like to add you to the,
On iNaturalist?
yeah.
One, I think we're already connected and I'm never on there. Just email me.
Okay. All right. You got it. All right. Are there any other questions for Jennifer?
Like Adrienne has her hand up.
Oh, Adrienne. Yes, please unmute. I don't see her
Yep,
hand.
I somehow, I don't know how I put my hand up. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I don't even see me up there.
So,
Okay.
How the heck do I get it for?
All right.
thank you. Did I miss any comments? I didn't even get a chance to look at them. Did I get to everyone?
I'll copy the chat and I'll send you all the chat. You got all the questions. There are comments for sure.
Okay. And I'll send you some resources. So I hope that gives you a better understanding. If there's any information that Heather Holm tells you that is different from what I said, always defer to what Heather Holm says. She's the expert. I'm just the enthusiast. So, but
Okay,
native
wait.
bees are awesome.
Trix has actually raised her hand. So Trix, if you want to unmute, if you intended to raise your hand.
One of the things that drives me nuts, and I was wondering if you tell people, is that all these wildflower companies do not say that they advertise wildflowers, but they don't say whether they're native or not, and you go and look them up and
Yep.
they're not native. And do you point that out to folks? Because I think they need to know that.
I do, but I usually just tell them to look for native plants, not the word wildflower, and not to look for pollinator plants, but to look for native plants and find out what is native to their region and find their local native nurseries and support them.
Because that's much harder.
It's,
Every
there's a
year-
national group called Wild Ones. I don't know if
Right.
you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I'm a member, and
Okay.
they advertise, I hope people know that they advertise where you to find native plants, because it's not always easy.
Well, there are places online that can make it easy anywhere that you are. There are places locally, and there are groups like Wild Ones that have chapters across the US that can help you, or you can just go online and reach out to them as well. So you have to do a little more research, but it's not as hard. And I say this as someone who created her first pollinator garden in, oh goodness, it must have been 92. And it was a debacle. It was a debacle of crabgrass and angry neighbors. It was just horrible. And it was because there just wasn't as much information then. And a lot of the information out there turned out to be wrong. So the way they told you to care for it was just the opposite of what really needed to be done. So now, as you can see from my little background image, I'm doing great growing plants, but I didn't garden for decades because it was so awful. So I can say it is night and day easier now than it used to be. And yes, you have to go online and look around maybe if you don't know, but there's information everywhere now. So I would just encourage people to go and Google it.
Yeah, Wild Ones is very helpful.
Wild ones is wonderful. Can I add one comment to that, though?
Sure.
Is please, if you're gonna get your native plants, try to get them eco-region specific. Because it does make a difference for pollinators.
I couldn't hear what you said, Adrian.
Get it eco-region specific. You know, like don't buy your plants from Washington DC or, Washington.
Well, you're talking about ecoregions.
Right.
And it's interesting because some people get very specific about that and say you want to buy things that are only native to New York State. Others say you want to think about the general ecoregion, which might be across multiple states. So yes, that is a consideration. I wouldn't necessarily bring that up to brand new beginners because I think it can be overwhelming, and I think the information is a little conflicting right now anyway, but definitely you want something that is native to where you are and not native to the other part of the country. You don't want, if you're living in New York, you don't want something native to Arizona. It's an entirely different habitat. Even if it's the same flower, it's probably used to a very different environment, and you would be better off getting seed that's a little closer to home.
Yeah, I would add too that a lot of native plant societies, like local native plant societies, might have, what you're looking for too. Around here, there's the Finger Lakes Native Plant Society, and they sometimes have like seed swap events and seed starting events, and so a native plant society can be helpful too.
They also
Yeah.
have some great webinars to teach people.
And Wild Ones chapters usually have lists of local resources for their area. And again, Google is really the best way to find anything. If you look up native plants in your region, National Wildlife Federation has a great search mechanism to find out what plants you might be looking for. And you can also just use Google to find out then where you can find them. So there's a lot of help out there if you're looking. You can also just email me and I'll help you out.